there's this general idea that like, oh, women are more religious than men. And then all these sort of reasons why that start with the assumption that this is a universal pattern. And then you start to unpack the data and you see, oh, okay, so this is primarily a Christian pattern, which doesn't mean it's not significant, doesn't mean it's not interesting, but it's not universal.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Pamela Prickett, a sociologist at the University of Amsterdam and fellow at Rice University's Religion and Public Life program. Today, I'm going to be talking about religion and gender and politics from a male perspective with my guest, Besheer Mohamed. Besheer is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center. He's worked on a number of national and international surveys on religion. Besheer, it's such a pleasure to welcome you, and I have so many questions. So let me jump right in with one about the moment that we're in, actually. We're dealing with a pandemic that has unsettled everyday life for Americans and billions around the world, while at the same time, America is reckoning with what many consider the country's original sin of slavery and the effects of institutional racism that legacy creates. As someone who identifies as Black and Muslim and is a researcher, what feeling is rising to the surface for you in this moment, and especially around politics?
I think my experiences and the experiences of many other African Americans tends to be somewhat different from that of white Americans. We see that there tend to be big racial gaps, even now, in a lot of things, and whether or not people say that they continue to support President Trump, and whether or not they believe in the Black Lives Matter movement, and whether or not they've personally experienced discrimination at the hands of police, feel like they've been unfairly stopped or something along those lines. And of course, there's been a lot of data coming out on disparities, health disparities by race. Sort of the infection rates, death rates have been different by racial group.
I saw that you published a piece in June on the Pew site that spoke to this kind of moment and the particular idea that Black churches have long infused political activism into their sermons and hymns. So I wondered if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about that research and the differences between whites and Blacks around bringing politics into religious practice and thought.
So this is one of those interesting situations where we asked this question before all this happened. This was a January survey. So we were just looking for kind of a baseline. Over the last 12 months, have you heard sermons addressing, we asked about criminal justice reform, we asked about race relations and racism, and also we asked, do you think that these are topics, these sorts of political topics, are things that houses of worship should be addressing? Like, do you want to hear that in your church? Do you think churches should be doing that? Or do you think churches, it doesn't matter? Or do you think churches really, that's not, I don't go to church to hear about that stuff. I go to church to hear about Jesus and about the Bible and not about politics. I just want to talk about the day-to-day interactions of being kind to your neighbor and these sorts of things. And we saw big racial differences on these questions, on all these questions. And the racial differences were definitely much more significant than the differences across religious groups. So look at white evangelical Protestants, white mainline Protestants, you look at white Catholics, they all were fairly similar, despite the fact that they have somewhat different theologies and all these other things. And Black Christians, regardless of the type, tended to be relatively similar, where the majority of whites were like, no, I'm not really looking for these things. And the majority of Blacks were like, yes, I want to hear these things. I mean, of course, there's diversity, right? I say the majority of Blacks, it was probably about 2/3 who said that it's important for these topics to be addressed. But there's a sizable number that are like, no, I don't want that stuff in my church either. And the reverse is true as well. The majority of whites, regardless of evangelical or mainline or whatever, were saying that they didn't want to hear these things. But there was a sizable minority who was saying, no, that this is important. I want to be at a church where these sorts of issues are front and center.
So I'm curious why you think that is, or what, because you have a PhD in sociology. And so I'm really curious to hear your expert opinion on why you think we see these stark differences in surveys of white Christians and Black Christians in America.
There are always lots of reasons why, right? Every person's an individual and their experiences are distinct, and you don't want to sort of paint with a broad brush. But I'd say there are at least two pretty clear differences. One is experiential. So, for example, it's the case that most Black men say that they have been unfairly stopped and targeted by the police. Something like 65% of Black men say this is the case, compared to like 8% of white men that say this is the case. And so if that's your experience, if you want church to speak to your experience and your experience is different, then church needs to be different too, right? Like if this is a massive part of your life, you're going through life and like this is something that you've experienced, that your friends have experienced, that your parents have experienced, that your siblings have experienced, it feels like a gap for church to not touch on it. Like this is the place where I go for sanctuary. This is the place where I go for guidance. And you don't have anything to say about this thing that affects all of us, but it only affects all of us if you're talking about Black men. If you're talking about white, it's a fairly rare experience. And so it's almost odd to be like, well, why are we talking about this? This isn't a thing that happens, or at least that happens to me or anyone I know. I think the other part is historical. The Black religious institutions have historically engaged with political and social issues to a pretty sizable degree. Now, this isn't to say that they've been sort of united in their advocacy of the civil rights movement or something like that. We know that one of the reasons why Reverend Dr. King started a new denomination was because he wasn't getting the support that he wanted for the way that he was engaging with the civil rights movement. There were people within his Black church, his denomination, that felt that he was pushing things, making things too political, pushing things too far or too hard or in the wrong ways. So there definitely has always been some variation, but it also has been the case that the church has engaged politically in a time where there weren't a lot of other mechanisms for Black people to organize. The church was a place where they could go and organize. It was a place where you could go and engage, where you could find like-minded people and talk through what are our issues and really gather people together to engage the issues, regardless of how they felt to engage. So I think there's both a historical reason for this, but also a sort of contemporary experiential reason why you see those differences.
Yeah, I think that's a great analysis. I think you hit on, so many things that I've been thinking about and really put them together in a nice crystallization. I'm curious, what do you see as the role of gender in these conversations and religion and politics right now?
So it's interesting because gender matters on a lot of these questions, right? There are gender differences on whether or not people support the Black Lives Matter movement. Women are about 10 points more likely to say they support the Black Lives Matter movement. Black women are significantly less likely than Black men to say that they've experienced being stopped by police because of their race. And even if you look at whether or not, if the election were held today, whether or not people would vote for President Trump or Vice President Biden, there's a 7-point gender gap there. So gender matters there, right? We see these gender differences, but it's also very clear that other things matter more. For example, if you look at the most recent polls of whether people have more support for Trump versus Biden, like I said, there's a 7-point gender gap. There's an 85-point party gap. There's a 57-point religion gap. There's a 46-point race gap. So gender matters, but not as much as some of these other things. And the same thing is true about the support for the Black Lives Matter movement. There's that 10-point gender gap, but there are bigger gaps by race, by political party, by religious affiliation than by gender.
Interesting. I'm a little surprised. I really expected you to say there were bigger gender gaps in these polls. So I'm curious why you think that is. Why do you see less of a difference in the numbers by gender in politics in America right now?
I don't know that I would say it's a right now question. I don't know that there was ever a point in which gender was the defining factor by which people made their political decisions. And I think this applies even if you look at specific issues. Views on abortion, for example, don't vary much by gender. The governing question for many people on the abortion issue is a theological one.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that takes me back to memories I have of 2016. Just the realization that there are so many single issue voters, and abortion is that single issue for many. And I can't imagine that's really changed for them in 4 years' time. So, of course, you're not in the business of predicting elections, but I would imagine you don't see the data shifting that dramatically over 4 years, or how has it changed?
No, I mean, views on abortion in particular have been stable for a long time, for as long as we've been polling. The views on abortion haven't shifted. They've been pretty stable. The country's been pretty split. There's a slight majority of the public that believes that abortion should be legal in most or all cases. But there's a sizable minority, something in the range of 4 in 10, that think that it should be illegal in most or all cases. And as I said, that difference is not driven by gender so much as by theology and by party. The Catholic Church hasn't changed their position on abortion. And so various evangelical churches haven't changed their position on abortion. And so this continues to be a point of contention. Now, another one of these sort of culture war type issues that comes up a lot of times in these discussions is views toward homosexuality or same-sex marriage. Now, one important difference, I think, between abortion and homosexuality is there has been a lot of movement on public perception, at least in the U.S., on homosexuality, on whether, for example, gays and lesbians should be allowed to marry legally. It is now the case that most of the public, and by most of the public, I mean about 60% of the public, believe that gays and lesbians should be allowed to marry. But that wasn't the case 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know if you've heard of the book And the Band Played On by Randy Schultz, which is about the AIDS epidemic. And I've just read that, which is an interesting book to read in this time. And it reminded me, I'm a child of the 80s. And to take me back to the 80s and to think like how much fear there was around sexuality. And just it does to somebody who's older than the millennial generation, it's like there is this really different or dramatic cultural shift in a fairly short period of time, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Relative to other social and political questions, the movement we've seen on homosexuality and same-sex marriage has been phenomenal. It's been incredibly rapid. I'd compare it to views on race and racism, views on abortion, on lots of these other issues. We haven't seen the shifts, 20, 30, 40-point shifts in a 20-year period. Like, that's just not something that you see very often.
I'm curious, is there anything that surprised you in the years that you've worked at Pew and you've done so many studies that looked at politics and religion and gender and race? I mean, what has surprised you that you've learned?
I think one of the things that really has jumped out at me as I've done this research is a more basic question about the intersection of gender and religiosity more broadly. There's a commonly accepted, assumed pattern that women are more religious than men. And digging into the data, what I've found is that what you're getting there is something that sociology and in general, sociology of religion specifically used to do a lot of and has gotten better at, which is mistaking Christianity for religion writ large and mistaking the West for the whole world. So what do I mean by that? In the US, among Christians, there's a 10-point gap between men and women on whether or not they say religion is very important in their lives. And you see similarly large gaps if you're looking at weekly attendance, if you're looking at daily prayer, if you're looking at even just affiliation, whether or not people are likely to say that they identify with a religion in general or Christianity specifically, or they're not. But that's not true everywhere. Globally, the gap in affiliation average is more like 2 or 3 points rather than 8 or 10 points. And in most countries that we've surveyed, there's little to no difference in affiliation by gender. So that was interesting to me. Like, we did studies in 192 countries, and in something like 131 of them, there was no significant difference by gender. And, as I'm sure you know, using attendance as the measure of religiosity is problematic for theological reasons. The extent to which attendance is mandatory and the mandatory nature of attendance is the same regardless of gender is an assumption that just doesn't really hold up. We know that for Muslims, for Orthodox Jews, there's just different gender rules around religious service attendance. But then even if you look at things like self-reported importance, in Christian majority countries, we do tend to see that women are more likely to say that religion's more important than men are. In Muslim majority countries, we tend to see that there's not much of a difference. In Israel, which is the only Jewish majority country, we see men saying that religion's more important. And we don't have great data on Buddhism or Hinduism, but if you look at China or Malaysia, we don't see large gaps among Buddhists either. So again, there's this general idea that like, oh, women are more religious than men. And then all these sort of reasons why that start with the assumption that this is a universal pattern. And then you start to unpack the data and you see, oh, okay, so this is primarily a Christian pattern, which doesn't mean it's not significant, doesn't mean it's not interesting, but it's not universal.
That's really interesting. And I appreciate you kind of challenging that very dominant narrative. Who are you reading these days? And specifically, are there women scholars that you could recommend to our students that they may not be familiar with that you would encourage them to read?
I think the people who I would tend to be most familiar with and I engage with most frequently are often people who are dealing with Islam in general, and specifically, to some extent, Islam among African Americans. And there are a number of people who are women who are really taking a leading role in engaging with some of those questions. There's an organization called the Muslim Wellness Foundation, for example, that is headed by Dr. Camila Rashad. There's another organization called the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative by Margarita Hill. So there are a number of scholars like this.
So if Pew came to you and they said, hey, we want to understand, we want to do a survey, what is it that you want to do? What do you want to understand about the American public right now?
I mean, I think in this moment, a lot of the questions that that are in the public discourse that an organization like Pew could contribute to with survey data, I think a lot of them have to do with the experiences of African Americans in general, and the intersection of African American experiences and religion specifically. Now, the religion angle, part of that's just because that's my area of interest. If I were a social movement scholar, I'm sure I'd be telling you social movements is the thing, but I'm a religion scholar. So that would be the lens I'd want to look at. But I think the experiences of African Americans in particular, in this moment, being able to bring them forward and bring them to light in a systematic, non-biased way, I think could be valuable because there's a lot of discussion around what their experiences are about, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the movement to defund police, with the disparities on health outcomes. There's a lot of things that are kind of in the public discourse, like, oh, this is a thing. I wonder what's going on here. And there are spokesmen of various types, that whether sort of formal, sort of talking head types or activists or just protesters whose voices are being heard. And I think that's incredibly valuable. But it's not always the case that the loudest voices are representative of the public. And so I think that one of the values of a survey is it allows you to see not just the loudest voices, but what are the general patterns among the public. And so I'd love to see more work looking at those questions.
Oh, I think that's a great idea. And I hope they come to you and ask because, that's exactly what people need to be able to draw some conclusions that are rooted in evidence. Well, I mean, I could keep going on. I'm really curious to hear your perspective on Muslim voters in the U.S., but let's save that for a later show. Thank you so much for joining us, Besheer. And thanks to all of you, our listeners of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. The Religion and Public Life program is on Twitter at RiceRPLP. To find out more about Besheer Mohamed's work, go to pewresearch.org. Today's show was written by Rachel Schneider and myself. Our producers are Three Wire Creative and Daisha Clay. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm Pamela Prickett. Until next time.